The greatest hardship for a medieval prisoner wasn't the rack or the Iron Maiden. It was boredom and paying rent. For centuries, our idea of a medieval prison has been shaped by a powerful and enduring myth. It is an image of dripping stone walls, of forgotten souls chained in the absolute darkness of a subterranean pit, their cries unheard by the world above. We picture the oubliette, a place whose very name, from the French oublier, means to forget, a hole into which a person is dropped and left to perish, erased from memory. We imagine dedicated torture chambers, filled with grotesque ironmongery, where pain was the only currency. This is the Hollywood dungeon, a cornerstone of Gothic fiction, and a lurid highlight of many a castle tour. And it is almost entirely wrong. The popular conception of the medieval prison as a purpose-built labyrinth of torment is a powerful cultural lens, but it is one ground and polished by later eras, not by the Middle Ages itself. The association of dungeons with systematic elaborate torture belongs more to the Renaissance and the religious and political anxieties of the Inquisition than to the general practice of medieval secular justice. The image was further cemented in the 19th century by the Gothic Revival, a literary and architectural movement that romanticized the medieval past, infusing it with a sense of dark mystery and terror. It was in Walter Scott's 1819 novel, Ivanhoe, that the word oubliette was first introduced to the English-speaking world, a romantic elaboration on what were already unpleasant places of confinement. This historical distortion is perpetuated today. Tourist sites often exaggerate the number and nature of their dungeons to satisfy the expectations of visitors. Chambers that were in reality storerooms, water cisterns, or even latrines are frequently mislabeled as dungeons or oubliettes to create a more sensational experience. The very word dungeon has been stripped of its original meaning. In Old French, donjon was simply the keep, the main fortified tower of a castle, the final defensive position for the garrison. Over time, as these secure towers came to be used to hold valuable prisoners, the English word dungeon began its semantic slide, shifting from the tower itself to the prison cell within it, and eventually, in the popular imagination, to the bleakest underground cell imaginable. This myth of the Hollywood dungeon is more than a simple factual error. It is a narrative convenience. It allows for a straightforward, progressive story of human history, where a barbaric and unenlightened past is neatly contrasted with a humane and civilized present. Later eras, from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, needed a dark age to define themselves against, a shadowy backdrop that made their own light seem brighter. To truly understand the medieval prison, one must first set aside this distorting lens and see the institution not as a symbol of our modern fears, but as a complex, functioning, and often paradoxical part of the society that created it. For centuries, our idea of a medieval prison has been shaped more by fiction than by fact. But what if the reality was something else entirely? Not a forgotten hole in the ground, but a place at the very center of town. Not a place of constant screaming, but of grinding boredom. Not a place you were thrown into, but a place you had to pay to enter. This exploration will journey past the myths to answer three core questions. If not a forgotten dungeon, what was a medieval prison, and where would you find one? Was life inside a constant nightmare of torture, or was the reality something different? Who got out, who didn't, and what determined your fate? To answer these questions, we will draw upon a wealth of historical sources, from 700-year-old court records, like the Assize of Clarendon and the Statute of Westminster, to jailers' ledgers from London's infamous Newgate prison, and even the personal poetry and graffiti left behind by the prisoners themselves. Through these fragments of the past, we can begin to build a more accurate picture of this forgotten world, moving beyond the myth to uncover the mundane, complex, and often tolerable hell of what medieval prisons were really like. Chapter 1. The reasons for ruin. How did you end up here? The path to a medieval prison was a tangled one, paved with a bewildering array of laws, customs, and overlapping jurisdictions. To be imprisoned was rarely the final punishment. Rather, it was the grim, uncertain waiting room of medieval justice. The reasons one might find oneself in this state were as varied as the society itself, ranging from the gravest of felonies to the most trivial of social infractions. The foundational legal principle governing imprisonment in the Middle Ages, a legacy of Roman law, was that a prison's purpose was for detention, not for punishment. The Latin maxim, repeated by jurists, was carcer ad continendos homines, non ad puniendos, meaning a prison is for holding men, not for punishing them. This meant that, in theory, the primary function of a prison was custodial, to hold a person accused of a serious crime, to prevent their escape before a trial could be held. For grave offenses like murder or treason, the actual sentence, if found guilty, was not a term of imprisonment, but a blood sanction, a public execution, or a gruesome mutilation, designed to punish the body and serve as a terrifying deterrent to others. The other major legitimate use of imprisonment was coercive. A prison could be used to compel an individual to fulfill an obligation, most commonly the payment of a debt to a private creditor or a fine owed to the crown. A political rival or a captured enemy of high status might also be imprisoned to coerce them or their allies into a political settlement or the payment of a ransom. However, this clean theoretical distinction between detention and punishment consistently failed to describe the reality of practice. The line became hopelessly blurred. A prisoner awaiting trial might languish for years before a judge arrived, a delay that felt intensely punitive regardless of the legal semantics. More significantly, the system of levying fines for a vast range of offenses created a backdoor to punitive incarceration. If a court fined a person for theft or assault, and they were too poor to pay, they were imprisoned until the debt was settled. This effectively transformed the prison into a punishment for poverty, a place where one's sentence was determined not by the severity of their crime, but by the weight of their purse. This practice became so common that, as historian Ralph Pugh noted, to claim medieval penology avoided incarceration is both anachronistic and misleading. The net of medieval law was cast wide, and a person could be ensnared for a multitude of reasons. Royal courts, especially after legal reforms like the Assize of Clarendon in 1166, dealt with the most serious crimes, or pleas of the crown, such as murder, rape, arson, and robbery. But the list of imprisonable offences extended far into the mundane details of daily life. In 1266, the Assize of Bread and Ale was enacted to regulate the price and weight of basic foodstuffs. A baker who repeatedly sold underweight loaves, or a brewer who charged too much for ale, could find themselves not only fined but publicly shamed in the pillory, or confined in a town jail. The vast royal forests were governed by their own draconian set of laws, designed to protect the king's game. Poaching a deer or felling a tree without permission was a serious offence, and cities like York had dedicated forest prisons to hold such transgressors. Social control extended even to leisure. A statute of 1388 ordered labourers to practice archery, a vital military skill in their spare time, rather than play games like football. By 1410, the punishment for violating this law was 6 days' imprisonment. Beyond the reach of the king's law, the church operated its own parallel system of justice. Ecclesiastical courts had jurisdiction over the clergy, and also tried lay people for a range of moral and religious crimes. A monk could be imprisoned in his own abbey for being rude to a superior. A layperson could be incarcerated for heresy, blasphemy, or adultery. This tangled web of jurisdictions, royal, municipal, feudal, and ecclesiastical, meant that the prison was not a single coherent institution, but a multi-purpose tool wielded by different authorities for different ends. For the king, it was a holding pen for felons awaiting his justice. For a city government, it was a mechanism for controlling debt and minor public disorder. For a feudal lord, it was a potential source of ransom. For the church, it was a place of penance and correction. The experience of any given prisoner was defined less by a universal concept of imprisonment and more by which of these overlapping and often competing systems they had fallen into. Chapter 2. The Great Divide. Noble, commoner, cleric, woman. Nowhere is the chasm between the myth and reality of the medieval prison wider than in the matter of social status. There was no single uniform experience of incarceration. The prison was not a great equalizer. It was a powerful magnifier of the rigid social hierarchies that defined the medieval world. A person's life behind bars, their food, their comfort, their legal standing, and their ultimate fate was determined not by the nature of their alleged crime, but by the circumstances of their birth. For a member of the aristocracy, imprisonment was often less a punishment and more a temporary, if inconvenient, change of address. High-status prisoners, particularly prisoners of war, political rivals, or rebellious barons, were seen as valuable assets to be leveraged, not as common criminals to be broken. Their primary value lay in the potential for a hefty ransom or a favorable political settlement. Consequently, their confinement was often a form of honorable captivity or house arrest, a far cry from the subterranean squalor of the popular imagination. A noble captive might be housed in a private apartment within a castle, perhaps the very same type of room they would occupy as a guest. They could be permitted to retain their own servants, wear their own fine clothes, and have food and wine brought in from their own estates or purchased from outside suppliers. The infamous Tower of London, despite its bloody reputation, often afforded such luxuries to its high-ranking inmates. When Anne Boleyn was brought to the Tower to await her execution, she was not thrown into a dungeon, but lodged in the same royal apartments she had occupied for her coronation just 3 years earlier. Other noble prisoners were allowed a surprising degree of freedom, permitted to receive visitors, walk the castle grounds, and even go hunting under guard. This was a world of imprisonment, governed by a code of chivalry and the cold calculus of political and economic value. For the vast majority of the prison population, the debtors, the vagrants, the petty thieves, the landless peasants, the reality of incarceration was an entirely different universe. Theirs was a world of shared misery, of being packed into overcrowded communal cells, often located in the lower levels of a castle, in a gatehouse tower, or in a purpose-built city jail. These spaces were frequently underground, described as pits or dungeons in the truest sense, small, dark, and airless, with minimal provision for health or well-being. The conditions were profoundly unsanitary, with no proper sewage and poor ventilation. The cells were breeding grounds for disease and parasites. The term ghoul fever, likely a form of louse-borne typhus, became synonymous with these deadly environments, where epidemics could sweep through the packed population. A contemporary account from York Prison describes a scene of visceral horror where the very walls are said to be covered with lice, and at another jail, lice were so numerous they were heard crackling under their feet. Overcrowding exacerbated the problems of starvation and disease. In 1306, Warwick Jail was reportedly so full that prisoners had died and die from day to day. This was the brutal, unglamorous reality for the common prisoner, a life of filth, hunger, and neglect. A third, distinct path existed within the medieval justice system, one reserved for those connected to the immense power of the Church. Through a legal principle known as benefit of clergy, anyone who could demonstrate they were a member of the clergy could avoid the harsh justice of the king's courts. In practice, the test was often one of basic literacy. The accused would be asked to read a passage from the Bible, typically Psalm 51, which became known as the neck verse because successfully reading it could save one's neck from the hangman's noose. Those who successfully claimed this benefit were handed over to the Church's jurisdiction to be tried in an ecclesiastical court. These courts were famously more lenient, guided by a philosophy that valued penance and reform over pure retribution. They did not use capital punishment. Instead of death, a guilty cleric might be sentenced to a period of penance or confinement in a dedicated ecclesiastical prison, often a secure room within a monastery or a bishop's palace. While life in these prisons was modeled on a penitential monastic existence, with solitude, fasting, and prayer, it was infinitely preferable to the gallows. This system created a significant loophole in the law, one that literate criminals eagerly exploited to escape the secular authorities. Women were a distinct minority within the medieval prison population, but their experience was shaped by a unique set of social and legal realities. While they were subject to the same laws as men, their confinement often took place outside the formal judicial system. A significant form of female imprisonment was non-judicial, with women being confined by their husbands or fathers as a means of control, or held as political pawns in dynastic struggles. Inside a formal prison, women were typically housed in separate quarters from men, though this did not always prevent illicit contact or the threat of sexual violence. Their vulnerability was acute, especially when accused of crimes that challenged the male-dominated political or religious order. The case of Anne Askew in the 16th century is a harrowing example. A Protestant noblewoman accused of heresy. She is the only woman on record to have been tortured in the Tower of London. When she refused to name her co-religionists, she was placed on the rack, an ordeal so severe she had to be carried to her execution. Her story, while exceptional, highlights the extreme dangers faced by women who transgressed the rigid boundaries of medieval society. The following table summarizes the starkly different realities of incarceration, demonstrating how the medieval prison was not one place but many, its nature dictated entirely by one's station in life. This system reveals a fundamental truth about the medieval worldview. Justice was not blind. The prison did not simply confine bodies, it physically manifested and reinforced the rigid structure of the entire social order. It was a microcosm of the feudal world, an institution where a person's rights, their value, and their very experience of reality were determined not by their individual actions, but by the class into which they were born. Chapter 3. The Prison for Profit, a Captive Economy. To understand the daily reality of the common medieval prison, one must look past the stone walls and iron bars and follow the money. The single most important and most overlooked factor shaping a prisoner's life was economics. Running a prison in the Middle Ages was not a state-funded public service. It was a business, and often a lucrative one. The jailer was less a civil servant and more a predatory entrepreneur, whose financial incentives were directly and catastrophically opposed to the well-being, speedy trial, and release of those in his charge. The primary income for a jailer or sheriff did not come from a government salary, but from a complex and exploitative system of fees charged directly to the prisoners themselves. This practice of institutionalized extortion began the moment a prisoner arrived. There was an entry fee, which might even include the expectation of buying a round of drinks for the prison staff to celebrate the new arrival. There were fees for being put into irons, and cruelly, fees for having them taken off. The case of Thomas Asplund in the late 15th century provides a stark illustration of this system in action. When the Sheriff of Cambridge demanded a fee of £10 for the removal of his irons, an enormous sum, Asplund refused, arguing the promise to pay was made under duress. The sheriff's response was not to negotiate, but to re-arrest him and throw him back in prison, demonstrating the absolute power the fee system granted to the jailers. A prisoner's journey through the castle system was a journey through a series of financial gates, each one guarded by a jailer demanding his toll. Once inside, the captive economy continued to bleed the prisoner dry. Every single necessity of life and every minor comfort came at a price. Food and drink were sold by the jailer, often at wildly inflated prices. A prisoner had to pay for their lodging, with rates varying based on the quality of the cell. A simple bed, or even just straw to lie on, cost money. Bedding, candles for light against the perpetual gloom, and wood for a fire to ward off the damp cold were all items to be purchased from the jailer. This monetization of misery created a stark hierarchy of comfort within the prison walls, a direct reflection of the prisoner's wealth. Those with money could afford better food, private rooms, and a degree of comfort, effectively buying their way out of the worst deprivations. The poor, however, were cast into the most squalid conditions. Unable to pay the jailer's prices, they were entirely dependent on the charity of family, friends, or religious organizations. This charity often amounted to nothing more than a single loaf of bread per day. Those without such a support network faced the very real prospect of starvation. This economic reality fundamentally reshapes our understanding of the medieval prison. It was not simply a place of confinement. It was a predatory engine designed for financial extraction. The punishment was not just the loss of freedom, but the systematic financial ruin of the prisoner and their entire family. The case of William Hemming, a chaplain falsely accused and imprisoned by an under-sheriff, reveals the system at its most corrupt. Hemming was subjected to horrific conditions, shackled in a deep pit and starved, until he agreed to pay a massive fine, effectively a ransom for his own release. This was a world where justice was not merely blind, it was for sale. The true horror for the common prisoner was not the threat of fantastical torture devices, but the mundane, grinding reality of a system where their suffering was someone else's profit. Chapter 4: The Permeable Walls. A social institution. Contrary to the myth of the isolated, forgotten dungeon, the typical medieval prison was a surprisingly social place. It was not set apart from society, but was deeply, physically, and socially enmeshed within it. The walls, while strong enough to confine, were remarkably permeable, allowing for a constant flow of people, goods, and information between the inside and the outside world. This semi-inclusive nature is perhaps the most defining and paradoxical feature of the medieval prison, creating an experience fundamentally different from the total institution of the modern era. Modern prisons are often deliberately located in remote rural areas, hidden from public view. The medieval prison was the exact opposite. It was designed to be central and highly visible, a proud and public declaration of a city's or a lord's power to enforce the law. In many towns, the jail was located in the gatehouse of the main bridge, a point of constant traffic and public notice. In larger cities, prisons were often situated in or near the main government compound, at the very heart of civic life. The famous L'Estincia in Florence, one of Europe's first purpose-built secular prisons, was a massive compound constructed in the center of the city, an unavoidable feature of the urban landscape and a potent symbol of the commune's hard-won independence and authority. This physical centrality meant that prisoners were not forgotten. They were a visible and audible part of daily urban life. People walking to the market or the cathedral would pass by the prison, and prisoners could often be seen and heard, begging from grated windows or being marched through the streets to trial. This public presence ensured that the prisoner, though marginalized, was not rendered invisible or erased from the community's consciousness. The prison's central location facilitated a constant stream of human traffic through its gates. The walls were porous, allowing for a level of social interaction that would be unthinkable in a modern correctional facility. Family and friends were the most vital lifeline, bringing food to supplement the meager or non-existent prison rations, as well as bedding, candles, and other personal items. There were no formal restrictions on such imports. Indeed, the system depended on them. Beyond family, a host of others frequented the prison. Lawyers and notaries arrived to conduct legal business. Clergymen, friars, and members of charitable confraternities came to offer spiritual guidance, hear confessions, and distribute alms. In some cases, prisoners were even allowed to leave the prison during the day. Debtors were often let out to beg on the streets, attempting to raise the money needed to pay their prison fees and settle their debts. This constant contact with the outside world meant that prisoners, while certainly marginalized, were not made liminal. They were not fully excluded from society or written out of its memory. They remained perched on the edge of the social world, a part of the community's fabric even in their confinement. For those inside, this strange, semi-inclusive existence was often defined by a single, overwhelming hardship: sheer grinding boredom. With no formal work programs, educational classes, or organized recreation, the days stretched into a monotonous expanse of empty time. Reading material was scarce and expensive, and space for physical activity was severely limited. To combat the tedium, prisoners turned to a range of diversions. many of them illicit. Gambling was by far the most common pastime, a forbidden activity that offered a distraction and the false promise of improving one's material condition. Prisoners blasphemed, sang lewd songs, conspired to escape, and plotted revenge against their enemies. For the literate few, writing became an outlet. At Lastintia, some prisoners earned money copying manuscripts. Others composed poetry and letters, like Ser Jacopo del Pecora, who wrote Terza Rima during his 15-year confinement. In Venice, prisoners passed the time by decorating their cells with elaborate graffiti, carving day charts, prayers, and images of ships and buildings into the stone walls, a permanent record of their humdrum existence. This permeability was a double-edged sword. It was a lifeline, providing the food, social contact, and news that prevented starvation and total social death. Yet, it also meant that a prisoner's plight was a public and familial burden. The financial ruin and social shame of incarceration were not hidden away but played out on the community stage. This fundamentally redefines the institution. The medieval prison was not a place of removal from society, but a unique, charged, and difficult space within it. This is the single greatest difference from the modern concept of the prison, and is the central argument of revisionist historians like Guy Geltner, who have sought to uncover the complex social reality of these institutions. Chapter 5. The Shadow of the Torturer, Pain and Public Spectacle. The spectre of torture looms large over the medieval prison, forming the grim centerpiece of its popular mythology. Yet, the historical record reveals a more complex and nuanced reality of judicial violence. While pain was undeniably a part of the medieval justice system, it was not inflicted randomly or universally. It was a tool, a form of brutal communication used by authorities to achieve specific ends, from extracting a confession to staging a powerful public performance of state power. The idea that every medieval castle contained a dedicated, fully equipped torture chamber is largely a fiction. While torture was certainly used, it was more often an exception than a rule, a specific legal instrument rather than a routine feature of prison life. Its primary function, particularly in the later Middle Ages as the legal system shifted from trial by ordeal to an inquisitorial framework, was interrogation. In a system that often required a confession for a conviction, torture was the method used to produce that confession, however unreliable it might be. The Tower of London provides a well-documented example. Instruments like the rack, which stretched a victim's body until their joints dislocated, and the manacles, which suspended them by their wrists, were used within its walls. The harrowing accounts of prisoners like the Jesuit priest John Gerard, who described his torture in the manacles, and Anne Askew, who was broken on the rack, are testaments to the horrific reality of these practices. However, these were high-profile cases involving accusations of treason and heresy. For the average debtor or petty thief, such an ordeal was highly unlikely. The historical record suggests that the mere presence of a torture chamber, or even the threat of its use, was often enough to serve as a powerful tool of intimidation and coercion. Far more common than the secret violence of the torture chamber was the public violence of corporal punishment. This was a form of justice designed as a public spectacle, a theater of law intended to humiliate the offender and terrify the populace into compliance. The stocks and the pillory were fixtures in nearly every town square, wooden restraints that locked a person's ankles, wrists, and head, leaving them helpless and exposed. The punishment was not just the physical discomfort, but the intense public shame. The community was actively encouraged to participate, pelting the condemned with insults, rotten fruit, animal dung, and other refuse. Other punishments were designed to leave a more permanent mark. Public whippings were common, as was branding with a hot iron, which left a permanent scar that marked the individual as a criminal for life. These acts were not hidden away. They were performative, deliberately staged to reinforce the power of the authorities and to visibly delineate the boundaries between lawful society and the world of the criminal. This distinction is crucial. The violence of the medieval justice system was not simply gratuitous cruelty. It was a form of communication, a brutal public language. Each act, from the humiliation of the pillory to the pain of the rack, had a specific purpose and meaning understood by the medieval populace. The horror of this system lay not in its randomness, but in its calculated, symbolic, and intensely public nature. It was a system that punished the body in full view of the world to control the soul of the community. Chapter 6. The Art of the Escape. Finding a Way Out. The myth of the medieval dungeon, particularly the oubliette, is a myth of perfect, inescapable containment, a final, fatal seal on a person's life. The historical record, however, is filled with stories that prove the opposite. Prisons were human systems, built and run by fallible people, and they were riddled with weaknesses, corruptible guards, architectural flaws, and porous social boundaries. For the determined, the wealthy, or the clever, these weaknesses offered a path to freedom. The stories of those who escaped are the ultimate counter-narrative, revealing the constant tension between the forces of control and the irrepressible human drive for liberty. The methods of escape were as ingenious and varied as the prisoners who attempted them. Cunning and deception were common tools. In the early 17th century, the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius, held in a castle for political reasons, arranged for a large chest of books to be regularly delivered and returned. After establishing this routine and lulling the guards into complacency, he hid inside the chest and was simply shipped out of the prison to freedom. A century later, the Earl of Nithsdale, imprisoned in the Tower of London, escaped by dressing in the clothes of one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting and walking out with the visiting party. Others relied on ingenuity and force. Duke Kęstutis of Lithuania, held by the Teutonic Order in 1361, noticed a small hole in his cell wall. With the help of a sympathetic servant of Lithuanian descent, he gradually widened the hole, carrying out the bricks one by one. He then climbed through the opening, up a chimney, stole a Teutonic knight's cloak to use as a disguise, and rode away on a waiting horse. The Jesuit priest John Gerard made an even more daring escape from the Tower of London in 1597. After making his way to a high wall overlooking the moat, he used a rope, tossed to him by accomplices in a boat below, to slide precariously across the water to safety. However, the single greatest factor in a successful escape was social status. A prisoner's wealth and connections were paramount. Nobles and wealthy citizens could often bribe their guards, a risky but effective method. Their high status also meant they could count on a network of supporters to organize help from the outside. The most famous great escape of the Middle Ages, that of King Richard the Lionheart, was not a physical breakout at all. Captured in 1192, he was freed not by digging a tunnel or scaling a wall, but by the payment of a vast ransom, a privilege utterly unavailable to any commoner. For ordinary prisoners, with no money to bribe guards and no powerful friends to organize a rescue, the chances of a successful escape were slim indeed. These stories demolish the myth of the perfectly sealed dungeon, revealing the prison as a site of constant struggle, where the ingenuity of the captive was pitted against the imperfections of the captor's system. So we return to our central idea. The medieval prison was not a forgotten pit of horrors on the edge of the world. It was something far more complex, and perhaps more unsettling. It was a public, profit-driven business at the heart of the city, a microcosm of a deeply hierarchical society, where your fate was sealed not by your crime but by your class. The true horror of the medieval prison lay not in the fantastical tortures of myth, but in the mundane, grinding, and entirely man-made realities of disease, neglect, boredom, and a system where justice could be bought and sold. The chaotic, public, and permeable nature of the medieval prison would ultimately sow the seeds of its own transformation. The modern prison, as conceived by Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century, and famously analyzed by philosophers like Michel Foucault, was a direct reaction against this medieval model. Where the medieval prison was a public spectacle, the new penitentiary was designed to be a private, hidden space. Where the medieval prison was a hub of social interaction, the new model emphasized isolation and silence, The goal was no longer the public punishment of the body, but the private reform of the soul through discipline, routine, and introspection. This marked a profound philosophical shift, the birth of the total institution, designed to remove the offender from society entirely, a concept that continues to dominate carceral systems to this day. And yet, the echoes of the medieval prison are all around us. The fierce modern debate over for-profit prisons is a direct descendant of the medieval jailer's fee book, raising the same fundamental questions about whether justice can coexist with a profit motive. The tragic and undeniable link between poverty and incarceration in the 21st century is the modern legacy of a system that once imprisoned people simply for being unable to pay a debt or a fine. The fundamental question we still ask today, is a prison for punishment, for rehabilitation, or for profit, is the very same question they were grappling with in their own way 700 years ago. The medieval prison is not a distant relic, it is a foundation stone of our modern world, and its shadow stretches all the way to the present day. But the story of the prison doesn't end here. The shift away from the public square and into the silent, ordered world of the penitentiary is one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of justice.